Our next speaker is going to be Stephen Smoot. He's a doctoral candidate in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature at the Catholic University of America. He previously earned a master's degree from the University of Toronto in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations with a concentration in Egyptology, and a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University in Ancient Near Eastern Studies with a concentration in Hebrew Bible and in German studies. He's currently an adjunct instructor of religious education at Brigham Young University and a research associate with the B.H. Roberts Foundation. This is something that's not in his bio, but I think I'd just like to add, he has been a member of FAIR since he was a teenager, so he's been with us for quite a while as a volunteer and as a contributor, and so we appreciate his thoughts on things. So with that, we'll turn the time over to Stephen.
Well, I'm very pleased to be with you all here today at this virtual FAIR conference. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person on the live stream to answer your questions and to have a conversation with my friends at FAIR, but I'm grateful to be pre-recorded at least and for the wonderful resources that FAIR has to record my presentation. So thank you to them, and thank you to all of our listeners who have tuned in at this conference this weekend. So I'm going to be speaking with you today on the subject of Joseph Smith and View of the Hebrews, right? This is a subject that a lot of people wonder about and have questions about. And in the past little while, I've been engaged in research with Mormoner, which is one of the research initiatives sponsored by the B.H. Roberts Foundation on this subject of View of the Hebrews and Joseph Smith and its alleged influence as an environmental source on the Book of Mormon. And so what I'm going to be presenting today derives mainly from the research that I've done recently with the B.H. Roberts Foundation. And the information that I have here is currently online on the Mormoner.org website, and it will also, I understand, be put online later when the proceedings of this conference get published. So let's get right to it, shall we? Let's talk about View of the Hebrews. Let's talk about its potential or alleged relationship with the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and what we can learn from our historical sources. So by way of introduction, for those who may not have heard of View of the Hebrews or know what it is, let's kind of get our groundings here, and then I want to run through sort of a question and answer format through this presentation to address some of the more common questions people have about View of the Hebrews and its relationship with the Book of Mormon. So View of the Hebrews was a book written by a minister named Ethan Smith, who first published it in 1823. In this book, Reverend Smith essentially argued that Native Americans are descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel that were scattered by the ancient Assyrians, right? The reason why this book comes up in the context of the Book of Mormon is because skeptics of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, or those looking for a naturalistic explanation for the origins of the Book of Mormon, have alleged that this book influenced Joseph Smith's thinking as it appears in the Book of Mormon. They have also tried to connect an Oliver Cowdery as potentially a co-conspirator with Joseph Smith who fed him View of the Hebrews or information from View of the Hebrews as Joseph Smith was composing the Book of Mormon. So that's what we're going to address here. So, like I said, we'll go through sort of a question and answer format and sort of try to cover as much ground as we can with the time that we have. So let's start off very broadly here. What is View of the Hebrews? For those who haven't heard this book, perhaps. As I said before, it's a book published in 1823. A second edition came out in 1825 by a fellow named Ethan Smith, who argues, and this is a direct quote from him, that the American Indians are the 10 tribes of Israel. That's kind of the central argument or thesis that Ethan Smith is trying to prove in View of the Hebrews. Ethan Smith believed that he could prove this argument or this thesis by both various authors and travelers who had made contact with Native American groups and had observed their culture and their customs, as well as by biblical citations and prophecies and Jewish history, all coming together in his argument to show that the Native Americans are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, right? So the first thing to know about View of the Hebrews in that regard is it is not a narrative. It's not a story the way the Book of Mormon is. It is an argument. It is a thesis for a claim that Ethan Smith is making, and he's defending that argument or that thesis, right? So just be clear and just be sure that you don't get that confused with other narrative books like the Book of Mormon. Sometimes people confuse it with Solomon Spaulding's manuscript found, which is a narrative. View of the Hebrews is not a narrative. It's an extended discourse or argument or thesis by Ethan Smith, right? Who is Ethan Smith, you may be wondering? So we know what his book is, so who is Ethan Smith? Ethan Smith is actually a really interesting guy, as I think. So he's born in the mid-18th century. He comes from a very pious Christian family. He pastored at several churches. He's most famous for pastoring the church in Pulteney, Vermont, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But he hopped around New England. He pastored churches in New Hampshire, in New York, in Massachusetts. By the way, that's a picture of him there on the screen that was provided by his daughter. It's a picture from later in life, obviously, but his daughter had it published in a book late in the 19th century. But it's nice that we have a picture of Ethan Smith, so you can kind of imagine him in his older twilight years. He was, as I mentioned, he comes from a pious, congregational, Christian, Puritan family, right from colonial America. So his father was a deacon in the Congregational Church. That's the church he's mainly associated with and that he pastors for, is the Congregational Church. He is a veteran of the Revolutionary War, of the American War of Independence, and in fact, he is there at Fort Knox. No, not Fort Knox. I'm forgetting the name of the fort, but the one that Benedict Arnold surrendered to the British when he betrayed the colonial army, the Continental Army. Reverend Smith, Ethan Smith there is at that fort when it was turned over to the British by Benedict Arnold. I'm sorry that I can't remember the name offhand. After the Revolutionary War, he graduates from Dartmouth College, as one does when you're a stuffy New England Puritan clergyman, right? A lot of them are coming from Dartmouth College. That's where Ethan Smith is coming from. Later in life, he becomes an outspoken abolitionist and social reformer. He joins an abolitionist political party in Massachusetts. And he is a domestic missionary. So he's involved in domestic missionary work and Bible societies and Sunday school associations and things like that. And besides View of the Hebrews, he also authored other theological treatises, right? His other book is View of the Trinity, where he argues for the classical Orthodox Trinitarian doctrine and the Godship of Jesus Christ. A lesser-known work than View of the Hebrews, which is the one he's most famous for. I should also mention there is no known relationship between Ethan Smith and Joseph Smith Jr., so we know both their family histories pretty well, and they are not related. There's no immediate relation. Sometimes some people wonder about that, but as far as we know, there's no relation between Ethan and Joseph. So that's who Ethan Smith is, our author of View of the Hebrews. So, like I said before, people wonder, so what does this book have to do with the Book of Mormon? Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, so some 50 some odd years after both Joseph Smith and Ethan Smith are dead, so late 19th, early 20th century, is when people begin pointing out what they perceive as parallels between the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews. The earliest documented instance that I can find where somebody makes an explicit argument for the Book of Mormon's dependence on View of the Hebrews dates to around 1902, when there's a debate between an RLDS elder and a Church of Christ, a Campbellite elder, where they debate the Book of Mormon. This issue comes up then. Now, this theory actually wasn't very popular or widely spread in the sort of the decades after the Book of Mormon, even in the early 20th century, late 19th century. Most people are arguing for the Spalding theory for the origins of the Book of Mormon, right? Most people who are arguing for a naturalistic origin for the Book of Mormon, they are not turning their attention to Ethan Smith, they're turning their attention to Solomon Spalding. I have a picture there of Fawn Brodie. The reason I have a picture of Fawn Brodie is because in her 1945 book, No Man Knows My History, a biography of Joseph Smith, she was the one who I think we can credit for popularizing this idea that Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews could have been a source for Joseph Smith, right? So she says, after her analysis, it may never be proved that Joseph ever saw View of the Hebrews before writing the Book of Mormon, but the striking parallelisms between the two books hardly leave a case for mere coincidence. So we're going to address that point because, as Brodie and others have conceded, and we'll discuss this in a minute, there is no actual evidence for Joseph Smith coming into contact with Ethan Smith or View of the Hebrews. Rather, what critics or skeptics have done is to say, because of these parallels that we see between them, that must therefore mean there was dependence, right? Interestingly enough, before this became a controversy or a skeptical argument for the Book of Mormon, Latter-day Saints were using View of the Hebrews. They were aware of View of the Hebrews. They were drawing from it and citing it as evidence for the Book of Mormon, right? For the Book of Mormon's account of ancient Israelites migrating to the Americas. So it's kind of interesting that for the first several decades, whenever View of the Hebrews gets brought up in a Latter-day Saint context or in a Book of Mormon context, it's by Latter-day Saints arguing for the Book of Mormon, right? Not skeptics arguing against it. So we'll see that here in a second. Okay, so we saw Fawn Brodie mentions these parallels. So what are the parallels between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon? I have a chart here I'll show here in just a second that give us the more commonly cited parallels between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. And this chart that I have, I'll throw it up here, I guess, right now. This chart comes from a number of sources that I aggregated together. We'll talk about B.H. Roberts later in this presentation. B.H. Roberts came up with a list of parallels. Fawn Brodie has a list of parallels. There have been some authors in the 1970s and 80s that threw up some parallels together. And then sort of in the modern internet age, Jeremy Runnels in the CES letter has a number of parallels between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. This list I have here just kind of draws some of the more common ones that I saw spread throughout this literature. Okay, so obviously the big thing is Hebrew origin for Native Americans. That's a point people raise. Both books describe the destruction of Jerusalem. Ethan Smith in View of the Hebrews mentions that there's a legend of an Indian parchment that was hidden up, that was going to be recovered in the last days, that there's lost Indian records. Some people see that as a parallel with the gold plates being hidden in Hill Cumorah. People talk about the fact that both books depict the Indians falling into sort of a barbarous or a barbarous civilization. There's barbarous and civilized tribes described in both books. They both cite the prophet Isaiah, which we'll see here in a second. Things like polygamy and riches and pride are denounced and so forth. So you can go down this list here and you can see these are some of the commonly cited parallels between the two books. And in a little bit, we'll kind of break down whether those parallels are legitimate or not, or how strong they may be. But this gives you a sort of a sampling of what are the most commonly cited parallels by skeptics, right, between the two books. So speaking of the Isaiah chapters, what about the Isaiah chapters? So do the Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon converge with those in View of the Hebrews? Again, this was a point that Fawn Brodie made. She thought it was significant that both books cite chapters of Isaiah. Other skeptics have brought this up. And the answer is that some of them are yes. There are some of the chapters that are shared between the two books. Back in the 1960s, Spencer J. Palmer and William Knecht compared these Isaiah citations in both books. And what they found out is that out of the 34 chapters that the two books quote, 9 chapters overlap. So that's about a third, right? So about a third of the Isaiah chapters in the two books converge with each other. They cite the same chapters. Now, people may take that and they may jump to the conclusion, this therefore proves that Ethan Smith is influencing Joseph Smith. In fact, I think that's unlikely because back in the early 1970s, William Riley published a master's thesis where he studied how the Isaiah chapters are being used in these two books. And what he found is, and I have the quote here, quote, "There's almost no evidence found which would support the idea that Joseph Smith's having used Ethan Smith as a springboard in his use of Isaiah and other Old Testament prophets." And the reason Riley comes to that conclusion is because the way the Isaiah chapters are cited in the two books most of the time are very different, right? So Ethan Smith is citing Isaiah chapters and Isaiah prophecies to relate to his argument that the Native Americans must be descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and that the continent of America must be the land being spoken of by the prophet Isaiah when he talks about the remnant returning and so forth. That's not really how the Book of Mormon is using these chapters. As several authors and studies on Isaiah in the Book of Mormon have shown, that's not really the interest behind the Isaiah chapters, is trying to prove that Native Americans are descendants from the lost tribes of Israel. The way the Book of Mormon uses it is to typologically teach of Jesus Christ and his gospel. Nephi uses Isaiah chapters typologically to explain the history of his own people and the visions he had of his own people. Right? Abinadi uses them typologically to describe the nature of Christ and his relationship with God and the atonement and so forth. So that's why Riley, and I think he's right, concludes that this is not evidence for direct dependence because they're used very differently. Okay? So people want to know, could Joseph have access to a copy of View of the Hebrews before translating the Book of Mormon? And the answer is conceivably yes, right? It is hypothetically possible that Joseph Smith could have had access to this book or had the ideas shared with him because indeed the book was being distributed widely throughout the United States. So in my research, and I have a sampling of some newspaper articles here, View of the Hebrews is being advertised for sale and it's being reviewed and discussed in newspapers all throughout New England, throughout Pennsylvania, Virginia, even as far south down as South Carolina is where I have found newspapers discussing this, right? So yes, conceivably, it's possible that Joseph Smith could have had these ideas shared with him, right? They are published in the mid-1820s, 23 and then 25. Book of Mormon comes out in 1830. So on those bare bones, is it possible? Yes, it conceivably is. However, and this is a point I want to stress now and throughout the rest of my presentation, historians don't deal with just what is hypothetically possible, right? if you want to make an argument for a direct dependence, you need to show evidence for that beyond just it's merely a possibility, okay? So I myself and other Latter-day Saint historians who do accept the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, I'm fine to say that yes, it's conceivably possible he could have accessed this. That's very clear. But that's not good enough if you want to argue for direct dependence. You need the next step of some kind of indication in our historical data that Joseph's aware of this and utilizing it at the appropriate time. And we'll talk about this in a second, right? And on that question, right, is there any evidence that Joseph ever read or knew about View of the Hebrews? And the answer is sort of no, not during the 1820s, during the translation of the Book of Mormon. And I have a nice quote from Stan Larson, who was once a Latter-day Saint, who became disaffected, lost his faith, but he still produced historical works on early Latter-day Saint history. In the mid-90s, he wrote a book on Thomas Stewart Ferguson, who is a Latter-day Saint sort of hobbyist scholar, amateur scholar, who lost his faith in the Book of Mormon. And one of the reasons why Thomas Stewart Ferguson lost his faith in the Book of Mormon is because he became disturbed by these, quote, parallels between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. Even so, Stan Larson says he acknowledges there is no direct evidence that Joseph Smith ever read Ethan Smith's book in the 1820s before the Book of Mormon text was dictated in 1829. And indeed, Fawn Brodie herself admits as much, right? However, Fawn Brodie and others do raise the point that in 1842, when Joseph Smith was the editor of the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo, he did publish extracts from Josiah Priest's book, and we'll talk about Josiah Priest in a second here, his book, American Antiquities, and that book in turn was republishing extracts from View of the Hebrews. And I have here snippets from that article in the Times and Seasons. It appeared in June of 1842, where Joseph Smith is quoting Josiah Priest, who in turn is quoting or republishing View of the Hebrews. And you can see it there, right? Citing Reverend Ethan Smith of Pulteney, Vermont, citing View of the Hebrews, page 223, and so forth. So later in his life, there is evidence that Joseph Smith, through some degrees of separation, was aware of Ethan Smith via Josiah Priest, but there's no indication during the 1820s or 1830s that Joseph Smith had read View of the Hebrews or was aware of its contents. So we have to be aware of that, right? Some people wonder, did Joseph Smith or his family ever live close to Ethan Smith? So if Ethan Smith is hopping around New England, in New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, in Massachusetts, is it possible that at any time the families could have overlapped? And the evidence, or the answer is no, not really. The evidence indicates that the closest Joseph Smith ever lived to Ethan Smith was about 50 miles, while Joseph was very young. And when I say very young, I mean he was like 6 years old, right? 6 or 7 years old. And I'll show you just in a second. After that initial period, the closest they ever lived was like over 300 miles apart, right? So it's unlikely that Joseph Smith ever met Ethan Smith or overlapped with him. And besides that, we have no evidence that for any supposed meeting, right? So let's take the two Smiths together real quick and run down our chronology. So Joseph Smith is born in Sharon, Vermont. And during this time, Ethan Smith is a pastor in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, 66 miles away or so. When Joseph Smith is like, 6 or 7, living in Lebanon, New Hampshire, that's where he has his leg surgery, right? Is there in West Lebanon. By the way, I say Lebanon because I served my mission in the New Hampshire-Manchester mission. And Lebanon, New Hampshire is in that mission, and all the locals call it Lebanon, not Lebanon, just so you know, right? So the next time you're there, it's Lebanon. In Lebanon, New Hampshire, he gets a little bit closer, about 50 miles, 48 miles, but he's still pretty far apart. And again, Joseph Smith is like 7 years old at this time. When the Smith family moves to Palmyra in 1816, the winter of 1816 to 1817, they move in the opposite direction, literally, of Ethan Smith. And the difference there you can see is wide, over 300 miles. And for the rest of the time, they are 2 to 3 to almost 400 miles apart, right? Where Joseph Smith is living and where Ethan Smith is living. So again, no evidence they met each other. Very likely they would have met each other, okay? So we can just sort of put that aside. Some people wonder about that. We can answer that clearly. Okay, what about Oliver Cowdery? Now we come to sort of the linchpin in a lot of the critics or skeptics' theory about Joseph Smith, the View of the Hebrews. Is it true that Ethan Smith was Oliver's pastor when he was a boy? So going back to the last slide here, you'll see that during this time in the early 1820s, between 1821 and I believe 1826, is when Ethan Smith is the pastor of the Congregational Church in Pulteney, Vermont, okay, where the Cowdery family is living at the time. So the theory goes, if Ethan Smith was Oliver Cowdery's pastor, this means Oliver Cowdery could have potentially had access to Ethan Smith's book, or Ethan Smith could have shared with him with Oliver his ideas that Oliver then in turn shared with Joseph Smith, right? Do we have indication or evidence for this? And the answer is possibly, okay? So what we do know is that Oliver's stepmother, her name is Keziah, and his three half-sisters named Lucy, Phoebe, and Rebecca Marie, they are members of the same congregational church in Pulteney that Ethan Smith later will become the pastor of. So they're not baptized by Ethan Smith, they're baptized by his predecessor in the ministry there, but they will be in the church that later Ethan Smith will take over after his predecessor leaves, okay? So yes, it's possible that Oliver Cowdery was a member of that same church and that Ethan was Oliver's pastor. Here's the problem. There's actually no record of Oliver ever attending that church, okay? There is no record of Oliver being associated with the Congregational Church in Pulteney, Vermont, okay? As a matter of fact, his religious affiliation before 1830, when he joins the Church of Christ, later the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it is unknown. As far as I'm aware, we have no indication of what denomination or church Oliver Cowdery is a part of, any if all, what church he's a part of before 1830. And it's dangerous to say that because some of his family was a part of Ethan Smith's church, therefore Oliver was also a part of that church, right? And if you need indication why this is dangerous, look no further than the Smith family, okay? So Joseph Smith's own family, right? His mom and some of his siblings are going to the Presbyterian church. Dad, Joseph Smith Sr., and his brother Alvin are staying home because they are unaffiliated with the church. Joseph Smith is attending Methodist meetings because he has a kinship or an affinity with Methodism. So the Smith family have a religiously diverse group. It's possible the Cowdery family was the same. We just don't really know, unfortunately. So Larry Morris, in his research on this, has pointed out that there is no document linking Oliver Cowdery to the Congregational Church in Pulteney or to the writings of Ethan Smith. There's another historian by the name of Emily Ross of the Pulteney Historical Society. Back in the 1970s, she wrote some letters, some reports looking at this, and she said that she could find, quote, no specific reference to Oliver Cowdery in the church's records. She further said that, quote, there is no further reference to any Mr. Cowdery and no record of Oliver being exposed to Ethan Smith's writings. Now, Emily Ross, she believes it's likely or possible that he could have been exposed to Ethan Smith's writings. She acknowledges that in her research, but nevertheless, she says there's just no evidence for it. So what this means is any supposed connection Oliver may have had to Ethan Smith or to his congregation in Pulteney, it's simply conjecture. Yes, it's possible that he was, but again, that's not good enough for claims like this. You need to show some positive evidence linking Oliver Cowdery with Ethan Smith, and that evidence just doesn't exist. So we have to be careful to try to posit that sort of connection. How about this? Is it possible, or didn't Oliver work in the same print shop where Ethan Smith published View of the Hebrews? I have two authors on record. John L. Brooke says, quote, it is possible that Oliver Cowdery helped to print Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews. The text was printed on a press in Pulteney, and Cowdery had experience as a printer. So John Brooke says it's possible Oliver could have helped print View of the Hebrews in Pulteney. By the way, the printer of View of the Hebrews was Ethan Smith's son, Sanford Smith, and his partner, John Smoot. Ethan Smith was involved in that press. He was editor for the paper they were publishing and the missionary section of the paper. So his son and his partner are the ones who publish it. And so John Brooke is saying it's possible Oliver Cowdery worked in that print shop. Richard Van Wagner also says, quote, although it is speculative, and that's saying the least, although it is speculative, young Cowdery may have been even employed by Smith and Smoot, the Pulteney firm that printed View of the Hebrews. Well, come on. No, there's no evidence that Oliver ever worked at the Smith and Smoot printing establishment in Pulteney, Vermont, okay? Our first known example where Oliver is working in a printing shop is in E.B. Grandin's print shop in Palmyra, New York, when they are printing the Book of Mormon. Now, some point to the fact that there are some sources from the mid to early 1830s that say Oliver Cowdery was a printer in the 1820s. There's a very good chance that they are mistaking him for his cousin Benjamin Cowdery, who was a very notable publisher in Western New York. It's possible that Oliver did have some experience with his cousin as an apprentice in his print shop, but his print shop was not in Vermont. It was in New York, and it certainly wasn't the Smith and Smoot print firm that printed View of the Hebrews, okay? So it's possible Oliver did this. It's not confirmed. Oliver's sister said that he was a store clerk in the 1820s, not a printer. And Oliver himself seems to indicate from letters to Joseph Smith in late 1829 that he is first really getting experience with the print shop or with printing in Palmyra, New York, not in Pulteney, Vermont, right? As a matter of fact, we have a pretty detailed history of the print shop in Pulteney, Vermont, the Smith and Smoot print shop. We have a pretty detailed history, and it doesn't mention Oliver's association. It does mention that Horace Greeley, who went on to become a very famous American journalist and printer, he apprenticed at the Smith and Smoot print shop, but not Oliver Cowdery. So there's just simply no evidence for this claim. It is speculative, and if you're going to make a direct link or direct claim, you have to do better than just speculation to say Oliver was printing View of the Hebrews, right? Could Oliver have somehow obtained a copy of View of the Hebrews and maybe secretly given it to Joseph Smith? Again, it's possible. It's certainly possible that could have happened because the book was in print, it was circulating, but probably not. Okay, and here's why. Oliver first meets Joseph Smith in April 1829, on April 5th, 1829. This is almost a year and a half into the translation of the Book of Mormon. We forget that Joseph Smith, well, some people forget, that Joseph Smith had already translated 116 pages, at least, of Book of Mormon manuscript, right? And then he loses this. In other words, by this time, by April of 1829, Joseph has already translated extensive portions of the record. He already has the ideas and the narrative down because he's already dictated or translated extensive portions of it. So what this means to me, I believe, is that April 1829 is too late for Oliver Cowdery to have supplied Joseph Smith a copy of View of the Hebrews, with which Joseph Smith then comes up with this crazy idea of Native Americans being descendants of Israelites and so forth, right? The timeline doesn't work out there. There's no evidence that Oliver Cowdery knew Joseph Smith any sooner than April of 1829. There is no evidence he ever met him in the mid-1820s, as some people some sort of conspiracy theories claim. There's no evidence for that. You should also keep in mind the fact some people claim, well, Oliver Cowdery was Joseph Smith's cousin. Oh, therefore they had a family connection. He actually is like his second cousin 3 times removed or something through Lucy Mack Smith. Okay, so they're not immediate cousins. They're not childhood friends growing up with each other. We have no evidence they knew that they were related when they meet each other. The reason they meet each other is because Oliver is introduced to Joseph through Joseph's family, right? When he came to board with them and teach school in Manchester, right? Manchester, New York. So again, it's kind of a conspiracy theory and it doesn't have a lot of good grounded historical evidence for it. And so we need to be cautious, if not skeptical, and reject this idea that Oliver Cowdery is kind of the mastermind behind this all, right? And as a matter of fact, if you want to approach this from a faithful perspective, from a perspective that acknowledges the authenticity and inspiration of the Book of Mormon, you might be able to go with what Philip Legg argued back in the 1980s. So Philip Legg was an RLDS historian who wrote this interesting biography of Oliver Cowdery. And here's what he says. I'll read the quote in full. If Oliver was familiar with Ethan Smith's book, what effect, if any, did that have on the way in which the Book of Mormon was produced? One plausible sequence of events is the following. Oliver's natural curiosity and desire for learning led him to read Ethan Smith's book. Upon hearing about Joseph and the plates, his interest was sparked. He set out to find the answers to the theories which had intrigued him. He may have been psychologically and spiritually prepared for his encounter with Joseph Smith by being familiar with View of the Hebrews. Now, that scenario from Philip Legg is also speculative. It's just hypothetical. But it is a speculative hypothetical scenario that you could plausibly sort of put together if you want to account for this from a faithful perspective. So even if we do assume that Oliver knew about View of the Hebrews, there's no evidence for that. Even if we do assume that he was supplying this to Joseph Smith, there's no evidence for that. Even with all of that, you still could possibly or hypothetically account for this from a faithful perspective, as Philip Legg does. Okay, so something to keep in mind there as we grapple with this certain point. Now, let's get to the parallel. So we've talked about Oliver Cowdery's alleged involvement here and so forth. Let's get to these apparent parallels that people argue for. Fawn Brodie and Jeremy Runnels and plenty of other critical writers. Okay. Is it possible with so many parallels that this indicates Joseph Smith took ideas from View of the Hebrews? Again, it's always possible. Sure, it's possible, but I don't think it's very probable or very likely. And the reason why basically is that under scrutiny, the parallels that people cite between the two books tend to break down. When you actually look at the two books in context and you sort of scrutinize these parallels, they don't really work, okay? So there's these different sort of broad categories I believe you can put these parallels under. One of them, there aren't actually parallels. Okay, another, they are superficial parallels, or they're just very general or vague parallels. And a third category, they are parallels that both appear in the Bible, making this, the Bible, a more likely common source between the two books. Okay, so let's give some examples of these three categories of these, quote, parallels that people cite between the two books. So number one, parallels that aren't actually parallels. So Ethan Smith discusses the Native Americans having a sacred object that resembles the Urim and Thummim that the Israelite high priest had as part of his priestly dress. Okay, this is described in the Pentateuch. It's from the Bible. He has this breastplate, he has a mitre cap, and so forth. He has this whole getup that he has as the high priest. Some have said, aha, Ethan Smith mentions a Urim and Thummim. This is a parallel of the Urim and Thummim in the Book of Mormon. Except the problem is the Book of Mormon never uses the phrase Urim and Thummim. Joseph Smith uses that phrase later to describe what the Book of Mormon calls interpreters, okay? So right off the bat, this isn't actually a parallel for this reason, is the Book of Mormon doesn't actually ever use the phrase Urim and Thummim. And second of all, the way the interpreters, or quote, Urim and Thummim are used in the Book of Mormon is different than how it's described by Ethan Smith being used by Native Americans. So for Ethan Smith, the Urim and Thummim is never used to translate sacred records. Instead, Ethan Smith says it's part of their, quote, pontifical dress. That's his description, used in ceremonial practices that Ethan Smith thinks parallels what the Israelite high priest is doing, okay? So besides the fact that it's not even there in the Book of Mormon, it's totally different. The instruments in the Book of Mormon are used to interpret sacred records, and in Ethan Smith's telling, they're used as part of ceremonial practices of the Native Americans. So that's not really a parallel. Oh, by the way, of course, also Urim and Thummim comes from the Bible. That's a biblical thing. That's a biblical description. So that can also go in category 3. Here's another one, Quetzalcoatl. So View of the Hebrews mentions the deity Quetzalcoatl from indigenous Central American religion, from the Aztecs and the Maya. Some have said, oh, this must be a parallel with the figure of Christ that appears in the Book of Mormon, right? After all, Latter-day Saints love to point to Quetzalcoatl and all the supposed parallels that he has with Christ in the Book of Mormon. Therefore, this must be a parallel between the two. I mean, there's no mention of Quetzalcoatl in the Book of Mormon, right, to say the least. And to make matters worse for this claim, according to Ethan Smith, Quetzalcoatl is not Jesus, but rather Moses. So Ethan Smith's whole argument is to say the figure of Quetzalcoatl must be a sort of corrupted version of Moses, the ancient legislator in Israel, and this goes to reaffirm his argument that Native Americans are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, okay? So again, this is a parallel that lots of people throw out there. It's not actually a parallel, in my opinion, because there's nothing about this in the Book of Mormon, okay? Nothing about Quetzalcoatl. How about superficial parallels? Superficial parallels that critics cite between the two books. Okay, so Jeremy Runnels, one of the things he cites is, quote, pride denounced as a parallel shared between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. Now, I hope you see this and you immediately think, but wait a second, pride is denounced in like every single major world religion and in literature and religious texts across multiple cultures. It's not like View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon are the only two books ever out there to denounce pride or hubris. It's in the Bible, at Proverbs, it's in the Quran, it's all over the place. This is such a superficial and vague parallel as to be meaningless. So it's not really a parallel, right? You can't just say they both denounce pride. You have to show some specific ways that indicate that the Book of Mormon denounces pride in a way that could only have come from View of the Hebrews, right? So this doesn't really work. My favorite example that Jeremy Runnels uses, so I think it's quite frivolous in my opinion, but he tries to say that the name Ether in the Book of Mormon, the prophet Ether, who has a book named after him, this is inspired by the name Ethan Smith, okay? Now, to be fair to Jeremy Runnels a little bit, he's following B.H. Roberts, who proposed this or kind of noted this down in an unpublished manuscript done in the early 1920s. B.H. Roberts, and this is how Jeremy Runnels quotes him, Ethan is prominently connected with the recording of the matter in the one case and Ether in the other. Oh my gosh, there you go. You've got Ethan and Ether. Oh man, there's your parallel. Well, what Jeremy Runnels doesn't do, because I'm convinced he hasn't actually read B.H. Roberts' Book of Mormon Studies, but he was piggybacking off of some guy on Reddit who is piggybacking off of some other website, I'm pretty sure, they leave out what Roberts concluded about this. And I have the picture there from the original manuscript of Roberts' study. Do not take this idea too seriously, however. It is merely a passing suggestion of a bare possibility. So even B.H. Roberts in his Book of Mormon studies that Runnels and others cite, even he says, nah, this is kind of dumb. It's just a very vague general possibility. Don't take it too seriously. But the CES letter does take it seriously. And so because of that, plenty of people on the internet take it seriously too. But it's not serious. It is a frivolous, superficial parallel, okay? Finally, parallels that share a Bible as a common source. So Ethan Smith talks about the lost 10 tribes being brought into, quote, a further country where never mankind has dwelt, end quote. And this, according to critics, seems to parallel the language of Ether 2:5 that says the Lord led the Jaredites, quote, into that quarter where there never had been man, or never had man been. Aha, there you go. Here's Joseph Smith directly quoting View of the Hebrews, some people claim. Except, too bad, it's actually from the Apocrypha. Ethan Smith is quoting 2 Esdras 13, 40 through 41, which is in the Bible. So this is an example of where View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon are sharing common biblical language with each other. And this is what Blake Ostler pointed out, and I think he's absolutely right. This similarity does not present identical phraseology and contains significant dissimilarities, for the Jaredites obey God by going further into the uninhabited land, while the 10 tribes disobey God by doing so. Further, any similarity in language could be explained by mutual dependence on 2 Esdras, which was included in Joseph Smith's Bible. And a lot of the other parallels could fall into this category too. So, like I was saying, I don't think these parallels are especially convincing. Once you scrutinize them, they tend to break down. The other famous one, of course, is that both books open with the destruction of Jerusalem. That's suspicious to a lot of people, except, of course, in View of the Hebrews, the Jerusalem being destroyed is Roman-era Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem during the time of Christ, in the context of Ethan Smith showing that Christ's predictions in Matthew 24 were fulfilled by the fact the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. In the Book of Mormon, of course, it's the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the scattering of the lost 10 tribes, per se, but rather it's explaining why Lehi and his family left Jerusalem. So another parallel, among many others we could go through, but for sake of time we won't, that break down under close scrutiny. In other words, what I think is happening here is the phenomenon of parallelomania. I think a lot of these parallels people see between the two books are the result of a tendency to see excessive and unwarranted parallels or similarities, which is what parallelomania is. Most of the time, these are stripped out of their context, and they're just sort of thrown together side by side in these parallel charts to make them seem really impressive or really daunting. But when you break it down, the parallels are, most of them are rather superficial. I would be willing to bet money that Jeremy Runnels or others really haven't read View of the Hebrews closely, if at all, and they're just piggybacking off of other people who have pointed out through these, quote, parallels. But read the book for yourself, and you can see what I'm talking about. As Blake Ostler noted, I think this is true, no single parallel between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon presents identical language or ideas expressed so similarly as to suggest direct dependence. And I would be happy to have examples shown to me otherwise that disprove this, but I think Ostler is absolutely correct here. I think we need to keep that in mind. Okay, so enough for the parallels. Let's address some other questions here. Was the central argument in View of the Hebrews unique? This argument that Native Americans are related to the tribes of Israel. Was this Ethan Smith's own unique kind of original insight or argument? The answer is no. There were, in fact, several writers in the late 18th and early 19th century who thought Native Americans were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and they tried to argue as such. In other words, Joseph Smith did not need View of the Hebrews specifically to potentially get this idea in his brain that Native Americans have an Israelite ancestry. And I actually hear critics kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth on this point, because on the one hand, they want to say, oh, this idea was so common in 19th century America, this idea of the so-called Hebraic Indian theory that the Native Americans are descendants of ancient Hebrews. This was so common that Joseph Smith could have gotten it from anywhere in his environment. They say that on the one hand, while at the same time saying, oh, but he had to have gotten it from Ethan Smith. Well, no, either it's one or the other. He could have gotten it from Ethan Smith, probably among others, but like you can't focus specifically on Ethan Smith and say he's sort of uniquely the source for the Book of Mormon, while at the same time saying, oh, it was everywhere at the same time. He could have gotten it from anywhere. So you kind of have to pick one or the other. Here are just some of the books, the more prominent ones promoting this Hebraic Indian theory. You can see it there on your list. This literature is actually in some ways very interesting. It's been discussed and analyzed by historians quite extensively. It reveals a lot of interesting early 19th century thinking about American attitudes towards Native Americans and their relationship with biblical people and so forth. So in their own right, they're very interesting. And you don't have to posit that Ethan Smith is like uniquely the guy Joseph Smith is getting this from, right? Could Joseph Smith have gotten his ideas from these other books, right? So could he have gotten these for the Book of Mormon from these other authors? Again, it's always possible. It's always hypothetically possible, but I don't think it's very probable. Besides the fact that, again, there's no evidence that Joseph's influenced or aware of these books. I'll show Richard Bushman here in a second discussing the fact that the Book of Mormon in some significant ways is very different from this sort of genre of literature, this Hebraic Indian theory literature, right? We do want to, however, discuss real quick Josiah Priest's book. I mentioned Josiah Priest earlier. So Josiah Priest has a book that is in the Manchester, New York Town Library where the Smiths are living. Some people point to his book as possibly a source for Joseph Smith to get some of his ideas. So let's look at this for a second. It is this book, The Wonders of Nature and Providence Displayed, is originally published in like 1826, I believe. And it circulates. It's kind of a crazy book because what Josiah Priest did was he just kind of took a hodgepodge of other books and republished them in this kind of bigger book, right? And that includes Ethan Smith, right? So the library in Manchester, it does have a wider range of books. Eric Paul Roberts, I believe, Robert Eric Paul, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name. But there was a scholar back in BYU Studies who looked at this in the late 80s, and he was able to catalog what books we know they were in this library. And among these was a copy of Josiah Priest's book, which contained verbatim extracts from the from View of the Hebrews, which skeptics say, therefore, Joseph Smith got his hands on and then put into the Book of Mormon, right? Well, here's a couple problems with that, or things that we kind of have to keep in mind as we approach this. Okay, first of all, there's no evidence that Joseph Smith or his family are patrons of this library, okay? So you have to pay membership fees to get into the library and to use it, and we don't have record of Joseph Smith ever doing that, or members of his family doing that, okay? Second of all, he doesn't need to go all the way to the Manchester library that's 5 miles away. He can go to Palmyra, which is 2 miles away, and there's potential stuff he can access there. If you just kind of want to argue for this naturalistic theory, why are you going to Manchester when conceivably he could have gone to Palmyra and who knows whatever untold number of books he could have gotten there. So it's kind of self-defeating to focus on the Manchester library when there's other at least plausible explanations for this, right? The other problem with this is that, as John W. Welch has pointed out, most of the translation of the Book of Mormon is happening in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where there is no local library. So let me quote John Welch on this. Even if Joseph had wanted to pause to check his details against reputable sources, to scrutinize the latest theories, to learn about scholarly biblical interpretations or Jewish customs, or to verify any Book of Mormon claims against the wisdom or theologies of his day, even if he had wanted to go to a library to check such things, something he showed no inclination to do until later, there simply was no library anywhere nearby for him to use while he's down in Harmony. While this is only a piece of circumstantial evidence for the Book of Mormon, it is still a piece, perhaps a significant one, okay? It should also not be forgotten, as Lucy Mack points out, that of all her kids, she says Joseph was much less inclined to the perusal of books than the rest of our children, but he was far more given to meditation or deep study. So, is it possible? Is it conceivably, hypothetically possible? Sure, it certainly is. But that's not good enough if you want to demonstrate or argue for some kind of direct link. You need some piece of evidence that pushes you over that edge. And skeptics so far have not been able to do that. Now, here's an interesting question. So Ethan Smith dies in 1848-49. Joseph Smith dies in 1844. So they were contemporaries. Did Ethan Smith ever comment on similarities, supposed similarities between his book and the Book of Mormon? No, we have no record of Ethan Smith ever publicly criticizing or refuting Joseph Smith. He does get mad at people like William Miller, who's another prominent contemporary Christian figure. They have arguments in the newspaper and so forth, but there's no evidence of him ever criticizing Joseph Smith. I'd love to see a record of that if there is one, but I've looked and I can't find any. If somebody finds one, I'd be happy to be corrected, but as far as we can tell, no. The fact that Ethan doesn't bother to point out these supposed parallels and similarities, I think that may be significant. Do any other contemporaries in the 1830s or 40s, do they ever accuse Joseph Smith of plagiarizing View of the Hebrews? Okay, so remember, the earliest we have on record are from the late 19th century, early 20th century. Is there anybody in the 1830s or 40s? No, again, not according to anything that we can find. I've tried to look for them. I can't find any sources. The closest we get is this guy, who's a guy named Constantine Samuel Rafinesque. He's a naturalist, he's a polymath, he's a scholar. He writes on Native American origins and customs and languages and so forth. Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, he is deeply skeptical and dismissive and derisive of the Hebraic Indian theory. So he thinks it's all a big joke. He vocally criticizes Ethan Smith and his book. He writes negative reviews and Ethan Smith responds and they have a back and forth. He's the closest we have, but he doesn't actually accuse Joseph Smith of plagiarism. In his journal in 1832, he merely cites View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon as two examples of this theory being super dumb, this Hebraic Indian theory, right? He says, two recent instances of egregious folly based upon the singular tenet have induced me to republish my letter of 1829, which if read by those laboring under this delusion cannot fail to shake their belief. He's referring to Ethan Smith. Book of Mormon and Ethan Smith are the two people he's referring to. A new religion or sect has been founded upon this belief, the Mormonites, thus called after a new Al-Quran or Book of Mormon, which is not a Jewish name. Supposed to be written in gold letters more than 2,000 years ago by Mormon, leader of the American Jews. This book, which no one had seen nor read but the founder of the sect, the probable writer thereof, has been made the Bible of the new sect. I have tried in vain to procure a copy of the translation wherein I could certainly detect a crowd of absurdities and incongruities. By the way, that's super funny. Even before reading the book, he knows it's all dumb and fake and stupid, which it kind of shows you how objective and critically minded he is here. I haven't read the book. I haven't been able to read it, but I'm sure it's really stupid and dumb, and it's just full of absurdities and incongruities. Now, the punchline here being, he doesn't actually accuse Joseph Smith of plagiarizing Ethan Smith. He just says, I think it's dumb what both of these books are saying, that Native Americans are descendants of ancient Israelites, okay? So let's answer a couple more questions, and then we'll kind of wrap up here. What do Latter-day Saints say about any potential connection between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon? So how have Latter-day Saints responded to this? So as I mentioned early on, Joseph Smith and other Latter-day Saints, they are citing material from View of the Hebrews positively as evidence for the Book of Mormon, right? Articles appear in the Millennial Star, in the Contributor, in the Times and Seasons, and other church periodicals and manuals. They repeat this. They are using Ethan Smith's arguments as evidence for the Book of Mormon. Once this became a point of contention among skeptics, a point of argument against the Book of Mormon, church leaders and scholars have argued, have sort of switched the argument to argue against the claims of plagiarism, right? And so Gordon B. Hinckley, Jeffrey R. Holland, Neal A. Maxwell, Tad Alcalister, plenty of church leaders have addressed this, sort of in general conference, for example. Scholars have addressed this. I'll show you some examples here in a second to argue against this. So it's interesting to see how Latter-day Saints shifted from citing it in favor of the Book of Mormon to citing it to show how the books are so dissimilar and to argue against plagiarism. So here's Gordon B. Hinckley in General Conference in 1993. It is strange to me that unbelieving critics must still go back to the old allegations that Joseph Smith wrote the book out of ideas gained from Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews in Solomon Spaulding's manuscript. To compare the Book of Mormon with these is like comparing a man to a horse. It is true they both walk, but beyond this, there is little similarity. The test of the book is in its reading. Elder Holland, I was in the MTC when Elder Holland gave this talk in conference. He called the Ethan Smith View of the Hebrews theory, quote, a failed theory and a pathetic answer for the Book of Mormon that do not withstand examination. Elder Neal A. Maxwell, in a book he published in the 1990s, he says, in more recent years, another explanation has been advanced. Joseph Smith supposedly took his main ideas, say these critics, from the writings of one Ethan Smith, who wrote a book called View of the Hebrews. With regard to the purposes, style, and substance of the two books, comparing Ethan Smith's book, View of the Hebrews, with the Book of Mormon is not fair to either Ethan or Joseph Smith. Love Elder Maxwell and that dry wit of his, right? And then Tad Alcalister more recently has addressed this at a BYU devotional. So there's been no shortage of church leaders who have kind of tackled this idea. Among scholars, right, Hugh Nibley, John W. Welch, Brant Gardner, plenty of scholars have addressed this from a faithful perspective. They point out, as I have, that the parallels are incidental or weak, and that the differences outweigh any similarities. John W. Welch, in fact, has cataloged over 80 instances where the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews significantly diverge from each other in content, argument, style, or perspective, right? So here's a quick little list of some of the approaches that Latter-day Saint authors have made, right? As I have said, there's no evidence Joseph is aware of View of the Hebrews during the translation of the Book of Mormon. The parallels are weak or unconvincing. There are many significant differences between the books. Some Latter-day Saint scholars, including Terrell Givens, have pointed out the fact that Joseph Smith republishing these extracts in 1842 is not what you would expect a plagiarist to do. So that's an argument against Joseph Smith being a plagiarist. Some of the crucial arguments made in view of the Hebrews are not cited by Joseph Smith. The overall purpose, intent, and structure of the books are also too different to suggest direct dependence. This last point is Richard Bushman's point that he's made time again, and I agree with Richard Bushman. In multiple publications, Bushman has addressed this, saying comparisons of the two works reveal too many fundamental differences. That was back in 1984. In 2004, he said, it's important to recognize that the Book of Mormon was more than a patchwork of theological assertions or a miscellany of statements about the Indians, like View of the Hebrews is. We will miss the point if we treat the Book of Mormon as a hodgepodge. And then in his biography of Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, Bushman points out the fact that the Book of Mormon actually doesn't make the main argument of the Hebraic Indian theory. He says, quote, the book refuses to argue its own theory, unlike these other books. So Bushman, I think, rightly recognizes this as well. What do non-Latter-day Saint scholars generally think about the relationship between these two books? Well, some believe it is possible that Joseph drew directly from material in the book. So older scholars have argued for this. But more recently, the attitude has shifted towards this belief that the two books are separate manifestations of this Hebraic Indian theory. So here's one recent author, quote, while it is possible that Joseph Smith knew a view of the Hebrews and could have borrowed from it, it is equally possible, if not more likely, that whatever parallels exist between the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews, they are reflective of a common cultural milieu and the common cultural pedigree of the two rather than an instance of direct borrowing. That, by the way, would be my argument too if I were to argue for a naturalistic theory between the two books, okay? A couple more questions and I'll wrap up. Has the church ever tried to hide or cover up the existence of View of the Hebrews? No, emphatically no. There are many church publications that have discussed this, including the Improvement Era, the Ensign, BYU Studies, Encyclopedia of Mormonism. There's no shortage of church or church-adjacent literature that has addressed this. In 1996, Brigham Young University published its own edition of View of the Hebrews that you can read online. And both the Church History Library in Salt Lake City and Brigham Young University, Harold B. Lee Library Special Collections, they both own original copies of View of the Hebrews, which you can go and read for yourself. And that's me in the special collections at BYU reading an original copy of View of the Hebrews. Anybody with a library account can go and they can read it for themselves. Okay, so no, there has never been an attempt to hide View of the Hebrews by the church. Finally, did Elder B.H. Roberts lose his testimony because of these supposed parallels between the two books? Again, this is a point that a number of people have brought up over the years. B.H. Roberts, well, let me answer and say no, probably not, in my opinion. For background, for those who may not know more about this, in the early 1920s, Elder B.H. Roberts conducted unpublished studies on parallels between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. These manuscripts were never published in his lifetime. They were published several decades later. After these manuscripts were made public, some argued that Elder Roberts lost his faith or lost his testimony in the Book of Mormon. I myself and others are convinced that's almost certainly incorrect. John Welch has written about this. Truman Matson has written about this. I have written about this. This is almost certainly incorrect, that this caused Elder Roberts to lose his testimony. After he conducted these studies up until his death in 1933, he continues to affirm his beliefs in Joseph Smith and in the Book of Mormon. If you go to mormoner.org, we have an article about this on B.H. Roberts and the Book of Mormon that you can read to get a sense for yourself. So it is true that Elder Roberts was concerned about these parallels. He thought these needed to be addressed. He thought that there needed to be a defense made to explain this, but the evidence indicates he did not lose his testimony. We can say pretty clearly Elder Roberts was sort of playing devil's advocate with these studies, because that's like literally what he tells Heber J. Grant and Richard R. Lyman in private letters written to them. He says, I'm writing these studies to lay out there arguments that critics could use against the Book of Mormon. We need to address these. We need to take them seriously. But that is not evidence that he lost his faith. And so people who claim that he has lost his faith, I believe, are not relying on good evidence or good data, and they are misleading you in what Elder Roberts actually believed. All right, so to wrap all of this up, real quick, I believe the evidence here suggests that any of these alleged connections between Joseph Smith and Ethan Smith and View of the Hebrews are tenuous at best. I believe that the similarities, the parallels that people have been pointing out since at least the 1940s with Fawn Brody, or even the 1920s with B.H. Roberts, they are superficial, They are coincidental, or they are rooted in common cultural or biblical sources, and you can explain them that way much better than by direct borrowing. I believe the historical record provides no compelling evidence that Joseph Smith was influenced by View of the Hebrews during the translation of the Book of Mormon. And the conspiracy theory that people throw out there, that Oliver Cowdery was the mastermind behind this, who got a copy into Joseph Smith's hands, and that he played a role in influencing Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. I also believe there's no substantive evidence for that. You're free to believe a conspiracy theory if you want. I prefer to deal in the realm of facts in this case. The facts are that there is no compelling reason or no solid evidence linking Oliver Cowdery with Ethan Smith and then with Joseph Smith, okay? What else? There are substantial differences between these two works, both in terms of their content and the purposes, their underlying purpose or their arguments. These differences, I think, make it implausible, make it further implausible to suggest that Joseph Smith used View of the Hebrews as a source. I think that when you stack them side by side, the unique theological insights, the narrative structure, and the spiritual messages of the Book of Mormon, they stand in stark contrast to the conventional, relatively conventional arguments that Ethan Smith is using that you also see in these other contemporary works arguing for the Hebraic Indian theory. I think we need to understand, or we should appreciate, that these distinctions, they underscore how original the Book of Mormon is, and they challenge this notion, this claim that it is simply a product of contemporary 19th century culture. The fact that people react to the Book of Mormon so negatively the way they do, I think is indicative of that. The fact the Book of Mormon does not engage the kinds of arguments or parallels that Ethan Smith and others try to make, I think is evidence for that. And so I think the argument for Joseph Smith's direct dependence on View of the Hebrews is weak, and the argument collapses under careful scrutiny. And this, in turn, I think reaffirms just how awesome the Book of Mormon is, its distinct revelatory nature. Finally, in conclusion, my last parting word to listeners: if you have questions about this, if you want to know about this, my invitation, my challenge, read the two books for yourself in context, not in isolated snippets. View of the Hebrews is available online. There's no problem in accessing it. It's not hard to get a copy. The Book of Mormon, there's not hard to get a copy. Read them together, side by side, in context, and I think you'll see for yourself that the arguments that people make for these parallels between the two actually break down under scrutiny. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I appreciate it. I'm sorry that I can't be here in the live stream to answer further questions later, but hopefully we can have further conversations down the road. Thank you so much.